Okay, here's the situation. It's 10:15 this morning. There's an announcement that AstraZeneca and some other company, oh yeah, Oxford, are working on some COVID vaccine. Now, when they make these announcements about these vaccines or the updates to these trials concerning these vaccines, there's always a lot of other dense economic information that's packed into it. The night before last, I was looking up information about a attorney, a prosecutor on the island of Yap, and I had a suspicion that there may be some connection with the murder of that prosecutor and trafficking of women through the Polynesian area, through the island area. My understanding is at the time she was murdered, that part of what it was about is that she had been involved in some investigations that were exposing. The articles spoke specifically about work she had done around handgun violence or around proliferation of gun-related crimes. But my understanding is that based on information about what she'd done previously, she had been involved with efforts to interdict trafficking. And my concern is that something had happened, and that was really what it was about. She knew something about this nexus concerning the trafficking of women and how prostitution was used in smuggling for other aspects, and that was pretty much what was making her the target at that time, because her death and other things connected to her death were a very, very monumental pivot point in a lot of global situations that were going on, including one connected to specifics around COVID-19, the precipitating events that allowed for the material preconditions for COVID-19 to become possible. And there was a report. The first thing I found, actually, one of the first two things I found was a report from Oxford University about the history of Zika. And it went all the way back to Zika in Uganda during the 50s. And the thing is that there had been a very specific process of biological testing that happened in Uganda in the 50s that was connected to what was later announced around a variety of immunobiological problems. And this is something I had come into information about around the time that Kofi Annan died. And, it comes up and it goes, and I found an article and I downloaded the PDF from Oxford University, probably around maybe 2, 3 in the morning. And by 5 a.m., somebody, while I was still online, so while I was still on my desktop, had intercepted my desktop and had taken it. And they tried to do something where they wanted me to forget. They deleted it from my cache history on my web browser. They also did something where they tried to ping me so that I would forget. I knew there was something. You know how that happens? You're like, I know I'm forgetting something. You're not forgetting something. Somebody wants you to forget that particular thing, at least at that time. It wasn't in my cache history, but I ended up remembering it when I put events back together. And I couldn't find it. Tried looking for it at the time. I couldn't find it. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to not go actively pursuing it because this means something. There's a reason. Oxford specifically. I have a theory about Oxford specifically connected to Rhodes Scholars and how they're connected to what's happening with COVID-19 right now. Now, today, November 5th, there was this announcement specifically about AstraZeneca and Oxford working on a vaccine. Now, there's a lot of things just yesterday I was going through and understanding that yesterday was 1 month after the 3-year anniversary of a mosque bombing in Pakistan that was connected to a WHO conference. It was a regional WHO conference specifically about immunizations. And for months, somebody had been targeting that WHO conference. I don't even, it was one of those weird things like, why do I know about this? Why am I on these currents? And I really understood it was like a real danger. Somebody was actively coordinating it, and it had something to do with other things I'd experienced. So I did what I could to let one of the Texas senators know, and then I contacted the senator from Virginia, and I asked right before the conference was coming up. I said, I need you to, I invoked an executive order around biological, chemical, and biological chemical weapons that had been in effect since the Bush era. And there's a specific protocol that was listed in there that one could invoke if they had a concern that somebody was providing component parts or potential for the manufacture of chemical or biological weapons. There's a procedure. And so I asked, and I invoked aspects of that procedure, and I said, can you please run a report or do an investigation concerning the implementation of these aspects of this executive order, and cross-reference it with, and then I provided them with the other information to assure that there's nothing that's happening right now that may or may not, or may be involved with what's going on in Pakistan. And I didn't get any information back specific about that, but that email was sent in connection with a request for documentation, personal documentation. I did get a response about my request for my personal documentation, but nobody said anything about the stuff about the request for the certifications or the invocation of that protocol in that executive order. The night that that mosque attack happened, I was sleeping on the streets, but I was with another person. I just met that person that day. He was an African American man. He was a total gentleman, but we were talking about something, and we were on a spiritual current. It was unlike things that I very infrequently am able to have that kind of experience with somebody. And the ironic thing is, just last night I was reflecting on an experience I had with a woman from Africa, and now today with this information, I'm supposed to project. I'm supposed to direct it to, I'm the woman and he's the man, right? Instead of it being me with a actual woman from Africa, okay, in a more masculine experience that had different implications. That now I'm the woman, I'm the feminine that was talking with an African American man at the time that this mosque ended up exploding. It was real time. I was real time aware of certain things, but I was on this particular current where I was reflecting on a variety of things. And what happened was that night, when I went to sleep, we were sleeping in front of a public building, and there were security cameras on, and the security cameras were looking at us, but it was as if I could see through the security camera that it was on some sort of bandwidth connected to something else, i.e. the red eye, right? This is the Gemini. This is the other side, the red eye. Yeah, remember? The next day I got a communication from somebody who was a senator, was not one of the senators I had contacted about this event in Pakistan, but was within a network that would have made him relevant. And he just sent me a digest about stuff that was going on in relation to what had happened to him. And the ironic thing was, there was a color scheme in part of what he sent. And that color scheme had been implanted. I picked up on it unconsciously. And when I was doing something online, I actually created something in a spreadsheet that had a design and a color scheme almost completely similar to what was reflected in the electronic communication he had sent me. At some point in time, within a week, I found out there had actually been an attack. There was a Sufi shrine in Pakistan that had been attacked that night. This was exactly what I was concerned was going to happen. That somebody was going to effectuate a terrorist attack in Pakistan around the time of that conference in order to sabotage the conference. See, my understanding is, in the current I was on that night, was reflecting how certain sacred spaces that have a certain sacred geometry and are connected to a spiritual praxis that can be healing without the intercession of conventional biomedical technology or conventional Western medical practices, are strategically targeted not only to effectuate a terrorist attack on particular other levels, but also as a form of etheric sabotage. It takes a space and a geometry that's previously understood to be sacred and potentially healing via invocation of ritual and tapping into ancestral currents around whatever is a part of the ritual, and they intentionally embed it with an extreme form of trauma or catastrophe. And the understanding is that previously healing, that previously cathartic experience of ritual then becomes embedded with an experience of trauma. And what used to be healing or soothing is attempted for a recapitulation as being strife or struggle. And there's this concept of attempting over time to force or compel the observant, the person involved in the ritual, to accede to a form of conversion. that you cannot be authentic in your faith experience because the embedded trauma and catastrophization of your faith experience is so severe that you have to cede to agreeing to swap it out. You have to agree to convert. You accept death in your own personal faith tradition and allow yourself to be resurrected as another faith tradition while somebody else swaps into yours. And I believe this is exactly what's happening with this alleged normalization agreement in the Middle East. And what they're not revealing is that they did the Texas turning twist that they did in 2017 using the CDC, except on a national scale in the Middle East. That there is an undercurrent where they are literally on a particular level underwriting certain kinds of securities for adherents of a particular faith tradition or that have a particular ancestry to be contrary or to be different. They convert. They convert the Christian, they convert the Jew, they convert the Muslim to another faith tradition, and somebody else has to swap out whatever the accumulated karma is with the other group. It's like a spiritual laundering. And this is what I mean when I say that what they're doing is they're embedding and encoding this concept of catastrophization in order to flip the Holocaust. As certain people have already had to process a certain karma around the Holocaust. And if you want to get out of it, you've got to convert. You, as a Jew, for instance, never get to the catharsis of understanding you've been able to escape the pogrom and then live as who you are at a certain point. Something or someone flips the experience of the Jewish Holocaust to another group. And conversely, if you are experiencing catastrophe in another manner, then you get to flip into. And I think on some level, somebody's worked some scam where they've convinced certain Palestinians, if you accept that you're the Jew now, then you get to lay claim or you get to engage as if you are a member. But then you also have to deal with a certain kind of karma. It comes with the history of the conflict of being Jewish, the anti-Semitism, the actual Holocaust. Well, I mean, if you've had the experience of the catastrophe, you know how to flip it. Well, what happens if you're actually Jewish? Well, now you're supposed to be able to ascend into what? And I think it's part of what has been going on in Texas with their conversion model. And I think it is an attempt for a variety of conspirators on a particular very high level to disengage a particular kind of anti-Semitism that was underpinning the LIBOR system in preparation for something else, but that is based on the same concept of an internalization of seeding one's own actual spiritual or cultural or ancestral belonging or legacy in order to swap it to somebody else. And depending on who you are or what the particular characterization of who you are is in this life at this time, then there may be, well, there's another demographic that you can be okay with. This is how you have all this horrible karma from what you actually came in with. But we'll offer you something else, and what you have will actually fit on somebody better. It's a form of spiritual laundering, and it's also a form of genetic engineering that is supposed to go into this karmic and spiritual laundering. And I believe that this is part of what they're doing with these normalization agreements in the Middle East. Now, the problem is these kinds of agreements would not be necessary if we hadn't had a protracted period, especially in the last 4 to 5 years, where things that could have been done to correct for or to implement processes of respecting sovereignty and allowing for an emergence of another kind of conception of leadership in the different kind of demographic paradigms had been allowed to occur. But with things like the Muslim ban, with things like the misrepresentation of what's actually going on with the Chinese hacking and the Russian hacking, with whatever was really going on with the chastisement of Iran around its nuclear program, and with the abject refusal to be honest about what has correlated as part of the rollout of 3G and 4G and now 5G in consideration of massive abuses of government process and the rollout of the digital economy. What it is it's a psyop to get you to concede, to relinquish your own inheritance, to relinquish your own legacy. You're supposed to be so ashamed. You're supposed to be so disgusted that you are willing to say, well, forget it. I'll just give it up. I'll just give it up. I'll just give it up. And what was mine before was taken by them anyway. Fine, I'll be them now. You internalize this self-hatred to the point, and you also project the covetousness that you experienced when others appropriated from you onto going in and ceding to, I will just be them now. This isn't a concept. It's almost like the flip of the concept of solidarity. There used to be this very popular mantra. It said all of us are Palestinian. And the understanding is that, it goes to this other concept of the civil rights movement, other kinds of global struggle. This concept of, as long as one of us is enslaved, all of us are slaves, right? This concept of having a love beyond yourself, almost like the concept of the Buddha that was not able to go to nirvana until everybody had been relieved. There's different concepts, different principles of this kind of compassion, but what's happened is, like they've done in the last 20 to 30 years, they've tried to flip so much of it. So now on the other side, it is, well, you're supposed to have internalized the process of shame that comes with the concessions that you've been extorted into, or the experiences of trauma that just seem so inhuman that you're willing to cede, right? It's part of how they liquidated the secular movement, and now all of us are now supposed to be defining again around some sort of religious persuasion, while we're going through some psyop of a undercurrent of persecution based on our religious preference. You're supposed to understand. You have to die. For me personally, for instance, you're not allowed to be a Jew. You're not allowed to be the kind of Christian you used to be. It's evil. It's sinful. It's dirty. You certainly aren't allowed to be a godless heathen because you're a Satanist. And if you're going to be one of those things, well, there's these characteristics. What is allowed to be the representation of the Jew? What is allowed to be the representation of this particular kind of Christian? What is allowed to be the representation of a secular humanist? Well, the understanding is that there's been so much betrayal and there's been so much shaming that's had to be internalized because of a failure to actually live up to the principles, that you will just cede and relinquish that identity. I've given up. It's a cultural genocide. So I'll just assimilate until whatever is offered. And what you have is a form of completion of an entire context of cultural appropriation. They're literally swapping us. They're swapping us out into an inheritance that's not ours because we're supposed to be so shamed for who and what we actually are that we'll just let it go. And so then it can be sanitized. And then it can be recharacterized. And it can have the junk taken out. It can have the nasty parts taken. It can have the personal, actual I taken out. And then we have a buffet of diversity, and we play our part and our role in the public sphere, while in the secret realm we just jump in and out of any body without any limitation, no boundaries, but also no concept of propriety or protocol or respect. And so then we internalize the other thing that's been going on, which is the massive electronic sexual exploitation that's been happening, the very intentional racist kinds of contrivances that are going on, this concept of an extortion into ceding your identity and allowing somebody else to centrally plan and identify and categorize who you are. while also limiting our information to actual primary source information. This is what I've been seeing going on, and I absolutely believe it's going on right now, and I actually think that that is the intention of COVID-19. We've been isolated and we've been cut off from what we would have previously considered our community experiences, while certain kinds of things are supposed to be embedded in our unconscious to make us feel overwhelmed to the point where we relinquish who we used to be. And once we relinquish and agree, you know what, I'm done with that, then something else can be offered. And once we get to that point in the kickback pipeline, we're so desperate, we're just supposed to take it and run. And now I believe this is where they're trying to get us. I actually think a lot of this is what happened in this last election, and that's why so much of the actual fraud of the election has been called out. There's a huge dissonance between what is actually third dimensionally verifiable in terms of any concept of rule of law or any concept of conscious engagement with social and civic responsibility and what's represented in the media. And when they confine us so we're not able to engage in the public space, it becomes even more exacerbated. In the meantime, all of these timelines that could have been met very easily are being intentionally sabotaged, and they're being intentionally messed with. And the point I'm making is that I continue to keep track, and it's panning out. Unfortunately, it isn't so much about predictive programming or that I'm some amazing or some sort of unconsciously inclined social engineer, but this was part of a long-term paradigm. And so I'm just hoping that whoever does end up getting these messages, that you understand that we wouldn't still be here at this time if we didn't individually and collectively actually have the power to come into our power. I think on another level, there is a desperation that their design is not going to work. And the major concern is, what have they called down in its stead? I'm not going to convert. Whatever was nasty or whatever was scandalous about the past, the people I knew always had the courage to be direct about it. But I'm not supposed to believe they exist anymore. And I'm supposed to accept they've converted too. The Jews are Muslims. The Muslims are Jews. The Christians are Buddhist, or the Christians are Jews. Truthfully, I think the Jew is now Muslim. The Muslim is now Christian. And the Christians finally get what they wanted, right? Which was claim that they are the genuine and true inheritors of the kingdom of God. And if you can shame the Jew so much, he'll give it up. And if you can shame the Muslim so much, he'll convert. You win. And you don't have to be responsible for the blood and the impact in the same way that the Crusades tried to record it. We've got a global pandemic. And while